At this time, I want to ask Miles to please put up the first poll question, and audience, please do respond, and we'll publish those results in just a little bit. All right, so we've talked about the why, and before we get into control, team, regulatory, all of that, there is a cost to this. And so we want to talk cost versus time and money. So first of all, we want to know, when is it appropriate or necessary to consider building your facility? You know, when are you having these conversations? Does it look the same for every company? And well, let's just start there, and we'll get into the cost and labor model. So Will, I'd like to start with you. You know, when are we having these conversations, and does that conversation, or could that conversation, look different for various types of cell and gene therapy companies?
Sure. I'm not sure about the flexibility across many different companies. You know, for the consideration when you go that path is always about, okay, how do we move from a preclinical stage through the clinic, you know, through clinical supply, and then eventually launch a product for commercial use? What is going to be the access that patients have, and how is it going to provide a real modality for the market, specifically for, you know, how does it help our patients? So these considerations, among those considerations, right, the other thing is, are you already established? Do you have a foot to stand on? Meaning, in other words, are you depending on venture capital, or are you, you know, working in a already established company that just branches out into this space? There are these considerations in general are really important to have, you know, to have solved. When we look at our own experience, right? So it was really important to be able to support a market the moment we would get approval from the FDA, meaning the moment we would be able to launch our product, right? So we needed to have the capability readily available. As it is an autologous process, you can't really build inventory ahead of time, right? And supply like a pharmacy network across the country or whatever. But what we needed to have is availability of slots to manufacture, existing and standing contracts with authorized treatment centers that we have established, or the hospitals that we work with, right? That really processing our product, you know, to the patient, as well as have the you know, the capacity ready to go to have approval, you know, together with your BLA, to immediately manufacture, right? So the sweet time, construction time of a cell therapy facility is not as, again, it's not as complicated as building a, you know, a cell recombinant plant, but it still requires, you know, you need to have suite configurations, you need to have air handling, you need to have all this, the supply chain parts, the material management parts of a large-scale facility, and you have all that available. So it takes a while to build. It takes a while to qualify and validate all the systems and all that stuff in there. So the sweet spot is you have a successful Type A meeting, meaning you go out of your clinical trials into a point where the FDA is happy with your data, and you show efficacy, you show safety, and from that moment on, you better be starting to build, because otherwise, you know, you drag your clinical phases longer, and you're not going to achieve approval right off the bat, you know, with your BLA, because that's what the FDA is also looking for. You know, can you walk that talk? Meaning, in other words, it's not enough to have your modality, your therapy ready. You also need to be able to make it for a reasonably sufficient population of patients. So at the time of the Type A meeting, you want to start building.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Mitch, from Kriya's perspective, you know, when was it appropriate or necessary for your team to consider building a facility? And on top of that, you know, for our listeners, you know, garnering capital, what does all of that look like?
Yeah, so we're probably in a little different situation. As I joined the company, I think I was employee 4, and the ask of me was, should we build or not? And so we did a pretty deep dive into identifying that critical mass I mentioned earlier, and when would we hit that critical mass, along with some, I think, other important criteria such as fundraising. We were still a angel invested company at the time. We were working on our Series A funding, and so we spent a lot of time thinking through how do we deploy capital efficiently at the right time. And so I think that's kind of the gist of this question. And so for us, it was, when would we hit that critical mass on the different parts of supply? I am responsible also for our vector core, our plasmid core, our pilot plant scale up, GLP and GMP supply. So we thought through all of those times points and what kind of a facility would we need and when we would need it. So I think there's a number of inputs here. Financial situation of the company, as mentioned, in terms of fundraising, the quantity of work at the critical mass. There's some other components, obviously. Technical complexity, I think, is a big one for us. We were trying to go very fast. We didn't have a process yet, or was designing a building without a process to design it to. So, moving those kind of ideas against what was available in the market, and how long do we stay with, say, a third-party supplier. And so those were probably the key inputs. Was the technical complexity was high, that drove us, along with critical mass, to want to build a facility. In terms of timing, it really was based on when we thought the first couple of programs would have advanced far enough that we can develop a process by which we could then implement into the facility and manufacture. I will also note, that we worked very closely with our R&D team and our development team to ensure we were developing a process that created a strike zone, so that our development team could pitch to, right? So that it fit our manufacturing platform, and that's worked out very well for us so far. One comment I would make is that there's a lot of risk with that approach, and so tempering optimism is really important to make sure the timing doesn't mismatch. You don't deliver something late or something too early where you have excessive overhead costs dragging down the organization, particularly as an early startup with limited funding. I think we get into some more details a little bit later, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mitch. That's great. Will, when it comes to, at the top of this topic, I talked about the cost and labor model. And so you're talking, balancing that, an empty facility is really expensive. So it costs a great deal of money. So what other considerations might cell and gene therapy companies consider to balance that cost and labor model?
Yeah, again, nowadays this is a much simpler process as we go into that, right? So from a labor perspective, right, the manufacturing operation of a cell therapy or gene therapy, it's pretty much the same thing, is a medical procedure. So when it is done manual, and as it is done manual, this requires a great deal of expertise, aseptic operation, understanding how to operate equipment that is not typical for your biologics manufacturing operation. There are no tanks, there are no chromatography columns or the like anywhere. So we process all of this in suites. We have incubators. We have things that we use for analytics, like cell counts and all that kind of stuff. And so the operation is really small scale. It is highly manual. It requires a lot of dexterity and capability to process small volumes, from one bag to the other, if you want, with food welders and all that kind of stuff in between. So we had to find the population of operators in a space where there's not a lot available, right? We launched out of West Los Angeles. which gave us somewhat of a great presence of universities around us where we could get graduates. But from our cost of living perspective in the vicinity of the facility, this is it's definitely a challenge, right? So cost was absolutely a driver, but not anywhere close to the priority of having qualified labor available to help us launch.